We are in week 2 of a new series that we just started last week on the names of God. I don't know if everybody, thank you, received one of these, but we've been giving out these notebooks that our team put together especially for this series to help support it. There's beautiful prayer journals, and for each of the names of God that we are highlighting throughout this series, there is information in there, and there's some prompts for you to think about. It's also a great tool when you're listening. If you want to take notes, feel free, pull it out. If you don't have one, I'm sure somebody can run it to you if you want to raise your hand, but wanted to highlight those. So, last week, Pastor Ryan gave us an amazing message about Elohim, Creator God. He talked about how we are purpose-filled, beautiful dirtbags. And yet, in the hands of God, God creates beautiful things out of it. And how made in His image, we get to do the same. I wanted to reiterate something that Pastor Ryan also talked about at the beginning, and that's how we can know a lot about God, and yet we can still be unfamiliar with who He is at times. And we're doing this series not just to add more head knowledge to our big heads, but we're doing this as an invitation to encounter Him in fresh ways. And maybe as we jump into today's message or in a different week, we'll talk about a name of God that you might be familiar with and have experience or history with, but maybe it also might be your first time really digging into it. I just want to encourage you to lean in, because I believe that God has an encounter for us today throughout this series. I believe that He wants to take us deeper into revelation of who He is and how He relates to us. So this morning, we're going to be diving into one of the names of God that's only mentioned once in the Bible. We see this characteristic of God displayed throughout the Bible, and I'll give some examples of that later, but it's actually only named once. God is given this name by a young African slave girl. She's a survivor of sexual abuse and domestic violence. She's a single mother without financial security or autonomy. She's a woman with no prospects or human-appointed authority. And yet, God meets her in her most vulnerable and broken moment, and in response, she names Him, El Roi, the God who sees me. We're going to jump into, we're actually going to spend a lot of time in Genesis today. I've realized the last couple of weeks, we're deeply in Genesis. So I want to encourage you, outside of our times together, feel free to really dig in on your own time. There's so much that I want to touch on today, and I'm also limited by time. And so I'm not going to be able to do the full context of everything justice, but this is really worth doing a deep study on when you have time. But we find the story of Hagar. This is the lady who names God El Roi. We find her story in Genesis 16. So I'm going to start reading through this. I'm going to break it up into smaller passages for us. But before I go into it, I also wanted to give a little backstory, a little introduction as to where we find Hagar in this moment, what happens before that, because context is super important. So, the main characters with Hagar in this story are Abram and Sarai. They're a Hebrew couple living in the land of Canaan. And they've moved to this land following the death of Abram's father and also his brother, and the leading of God. So God has given them promises. He's spoken these massive prophetic words over them, saying that He's going to lead them into a land that they can flourish and thrive in. He's going to give them descendants that are greater than the stars in the sky. And so with this hope, with this big prophetic word, they set out. And here we go. So in Genesis 16, verse 1, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not borne him any children." So they haven't yet seen any, in the natural, any beginnings of the fulfillment of the promises of God over them. She had not borne him any children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See here, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. I am asking you to go into the bed of my maid so that she may bear you a child. Perhaps I will obtain children by her." And Abram listened to Sarai and did as she said. After Abram had lived in the land of Canaan for 10 years, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian maid, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his secondary wife. Okay, we're going to pause right there. The first thing I want to say is throughout the next chapter, there's going to be some things that happen that are not cool. They're not cool by those standards back in the day, and they're also not cool by today's standards. There's a lot that we're going to talk about, and so I just want to preface, as before we go any further, that we're going to dig into some things. And there's also things that I want to highlight that were customary at the time. So, for example, in this setting, Abraham and Sarai, they have this promise from God that they're going to bear children, and yet they're not seeing it happen. When this happened in the natural, back in their context, it was normal for people who had privilege, like they did, who had people in their employment, who had maidservants, to employ somebody to become a secondary wife, essentially to become a surrogate wife to the master of the house in order to bear them children. And then the first wife, she would then adopt those as her own in order to carry on the lineage. So there's an element where there is customs that are coming into play at this point that is informing Sarai's decision to tell Abraham to take Hagar as his wife. And then the second thing I want to highlight requires a little bit more backstory. So in Genesis 12, Abraham and Sarai, they have set out from the land that Abraham was from. And in order to get to the land that they want to get to, which is Canaan, they go through Egypt. So Egypt to them is a foreign country. And before they get in there, Abraham, he freaks out. He has a freak out moment. He's looking at his wife and he's like, goodness, she's beautiful. If we step into this new land, she's definitely going to get attention from all the guys, and they're probably going to kill me to get to her. So in order to save my skin, I should probably give her to them. I should set things up in such a way where they're not going to see me as a threat. And so what he says to Sarai is, I have an idea. Let's tell everybody that we're brother and sister, and then we'll be cool. No one's going to kill me, and we can get through the land. So Sarai, as a woman in that context, she also doesn't have a lot of autonomy to be able to challenge that and say, heck no. So she goes along with it. They go into Egypt, and as Abraham predicted, Sarai gets a lot of attention, so much so that Pharaoh picks her out and brings her into his house as a secondary wife, which means that she is forced to leave her husband, leave her household, and sleep with another man against her will, okay? Pretty intense situation. So they have this set up. In the meanwhile, Abraham he stays with all the stuff, all the people with them, and he thrives. He finds favor in the sight of those around him, and they add wealth to him. So Abraham's thriving. Sarai is under the control of Pharaoh. However, God intervenes. He sends plagues to the house of Pharaoh, which wakes Pharaoh up to the fact that, oops, maybe this isn't all as I thought it was. And it comes to light that actually Abraham and Sarah are not brother and sister, they are husband and wife. And so Pharaoh forces them both out of his land, out of his house, and out of Egypt. And so they carry on. So I'm giving this as some backstory, because I think it's really important to know where someone is coming from, because it often informs the decisions they make in the present, okay? So we have this moment where Abraham and Sarah, they've gone through a lot of stuff in Egypt. They find themselves in Canaan, that they're striving after this promise of God, and they take matters into their own hands. You also have Sarah, who's the mistress of the house, who's gone through a lot of trauma. I very much doubt that either she went through any individual therapy or they went through couples therapy after this, right? So there's baggage, is what I'm trying to say. In this situation, we witnessed how fear has entered the picture. Fear has taken over the promises of God. Have you ever encountered that? Where fear's voice becomes louder than the word that God has spoken to you. And when we allow that to happen, it messes things up. As a result, the union of Abraham and Sarai's marriage is violated. Their covenant is violated. Sarai is left unprotected and subject to the desires of men who are not her husband. I'm sure that trust was broken. Suddenly, their covenant, which should have been held as sacred, is left open and vulnerable. I can only imagine, as a woman and a wife, how that would feel. It definitely wouldn't feel good. This would impact you relationally. as well as personally. That would impact your identity as a woman to be treated in that way. So we take stock of this moment with this kind of context, holding this context along with it. Let's jump into verse 4 and see what happens next. So Abram, he listens to his wife Sarai, and he goes into the bed of Hagar, and she conceives. And when she realized that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress, regarding Sarai as insignificant because of her infertility. Then Sarai said to Abram, "May the responsibility for the wrong done to me by the arrogant behavior of Hagar be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, and when she realized that she had conceived, I was despised and looked on with disrespect. May the Lord judge who has done right between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Look, your maid is entirely in your hands and subject to your authority. Do as you please with her." So Sarai treated her harshly and humiliated her, and Hagar fled from her. Okay, there's a lot more happening. One of the things that I think is important to note in this is the role of women in this context. Obviously, Hagar and Sarai have different roles. But for Sarai, she has this promise of God, but she's also a woman in a strong patriarchal society where she doesn't have full autonomy herself. Her role is to be a wife and a mother, is to help run the household. But without children, she both is not seeing this promise of God fulfilled, but even in the natural, she's not fulfilling what she has been told a whole life she's meant to do. So then she has in this moment another woman she sees kind of taking her place, even though she's had a hand in orchestrating it, and she begins to feel the threat, I believe. I believe that there's jealousy that begins to take place. And in Hagar's position, she's a woman who's not had autonomy either. She's been under the subject both of men and of women. She probably hasn't been called her name fully. She hasn't been known by people. She is more a solution to the problem than she is a human in her own right. And so now she's in a position where she is literally carrying something that suddenly give her some status, suddenly give her a bit of position. Maybe she's been able to build a bit of connection with Abram. And if I was in that position, I can fully imagine how Hagar in that moment would struggle not to throw that in the face of Sarai, just a little bit. So for me, it's very understandable in a human context why you would suddenly find these two women in tension with one another. And then Sarai, rather than choosing to respond with love or kindness and understanding, she is harsh. She humiliates. And we don't know fully what that means, what was done in that moment. But when you look into the translation of those words, the word that was used for treated harshly is also the same word that was used to describe how the Egyptians treated the Hebrews in slavery. So we know that it was not good, okay? I want to also pinpoint something that I think is interesting in this moment. So we talked about how Sarai, she has this experience in the land of Egypt, right? She is mistreated, and she is then in a new land with a woman who she's now feeling threatened by, who is an Egyptian. For anyone who might be familiar with trauma, you might begin to see the link here. But there is unhealed trauma throughout this story that rears its head in different ways. And as I read this, I felt like Sarai is probably getting triggered in this moment too. She's looking at this woman who represents to her a people that she did not feel safe by. She did not feel protected with. She did not feel covered by. And I believe that was probably triggering some unhealed trauma in her that she was also pouring out on Hagar. So there are so many layers of things. You know, trauma is one of those things that can, the way that it can trigger us doesn't always make sense in a moment, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pay attention to it. When I was thinking about this, I was talking to Philip about it, and there were different things that were coming to mind that I could share with you this morning. But one thing that came up, it's actually kind of connected to what Philip was talking about during giving. So while Philip was having this really amazing time being provided for at this ministry school, I was also trying to go to this ministry school, but my experience was a little bit different. So I applied, and I was expectant to get into the school. And then I had 2 dreams that I didn't get in. So I was like, ooh, we rebuke that, God. That's definitely not of you. And then a couple of days later, I got an email saying that my application was not successful. And I also had 2 other friends. At this time, Philip and I were dating. I'm in England. He's out here. And a couple of my other friends in England were also applying for the school. They got accepted. And to add salt to the wound, didn't take their place, you guys. They were like, no. And they changed their plans and didn't go. It's like, what? So anyways, it's fine. Initially, my initial response to this whole thing, I cried, I was disappointed. But then I was like, oh, but I also had this dream. So God, you're in it. So I was kind of accepting it. But, as time went on, I got to go visit this ministry school because Philip was there and spent time there. And later we have both spent a lot of time in that house. But for the first few years after that moment, I didn't realize how much that lie of rejection had wiggled itself into me to the point where I would be in that environment, I would begin to shut down. And Philip would try calling me out, and I'm like, no, I get defensive. But there was a seed of unworthiness, there was a lie of rejection that I had begun to believe because I had not been accepted into the ministry school that caused me to not fully receive from that place for a season. It caused me to not want to connect with people that had been to that school for a season. And it got in the way of some of the things that God was actually trying to do in that season. Thanks. But I say that because unhealed trauma can do that. If we allow it to wriggle itself in and we don't pay attention, it can rob us of what God actually has for us. And so here in this story, we see so much of this taking place. But God. So, Genesis 16, verse 7. But the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness on the road to Egypt by way of Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where did you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit humbly to her authority. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord continued, behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall name him Ishmael. God hears. Because the Lord has heard and paid attention to your persecution, your suffering. He, Ishmael, will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against every man, continually fighting, and every man's hand against him, and he will dwell in defiance of all of his brothers. Hagar was a runaway slave. She was a victim of abuse. She was pregnant and vulnerable, and she finds herself out in the wilderness by a spring of water. It's possible that she was attempting to run back to her homeland, the great escape. She was trying to get back to Egypt. And yet she's interrupted. She's met by this angel of the Lord. And when you study, kind of look into this, and I was reading about what different theologians believe about who the angel of the Lord was. And it's not believed that it was either kind of a regular angel or like someone like Gabriel, but it's believed that it was the pre-incarnate Christ in person. It's stunning to me. This image is stunning of a woman who in human circumstances had nothing, was the lowest of the low. She's literally fleeing her circumstance. God chooses to meet her in the wilderness, chooses to identify her, to call her by name. She's a slave in her context, so the likelihood of her being called by name is pretty low from what we know and understand, right? and yet God calls her by name. This is no accidental encounter. He seeks her out. He calls her by name. He stops to talk to her, and he wants to know her story. Where have you come from? Where are you going? What is your history? What led you to this place? What are you hoping for? What are you desiring for? These are all the questions that I imagine in between the lines of this encounter. And she could have chosen to ignore him, to shut down, to give some sort of a surface answer. Because remember, she's not had good encounters with men and women up to this point. People of authority have not treated her kindly, and yet she sees in this pre-incarnate Christ something different. She encounters his kindness and his mercy. She encounters the humanization that comes from him rather than the dehumanization that she has so far encountered. And so she responds with honesty, and she lets him in to her circumstance. And then he responds with direction and with promise. In this moment, he covers her and provides for her. She was a young woman. She was probably a virgin when she was given to Abram to sleep with him and bear his children. He was decades older than her. So in this moment, for her to feel covered and protected and provided for through the words of the pre-incarnate Christ is incredible. This has massive significance. He gives her strength that she needs to continue. God promises to provide for her son and the generations to come in her family line. He gives her a name for her unborn child, Ishmael. God hears. He heard her cries in the desert, and he didn't turn away. Instead, he pursued her. He blessed her with a living reminder of his heart towards her. And then he goes on to prophesy something over her that, honestly, most of the times when I first read this, without doing any study on it, I kind of just washed over it because it didn't sound great. And as a mom now, I'm like, ooh, if somebody said this to me about my unborn child, I wouldn't be down for it. I'd be like, ooh, no, I rebuke that word. You are not calling my son a wild donkey. So I studied this. And in all of the studies of the text, there is an interpretation that comes through. And so this is my translation of that, okay? Your son is being born into servitude, but he will not be subject to the life of service like a tame donkey. Instead, he will be wild and free. When you have not had access to justice because of slavery, Ishmael will be free to confront injustices around him and to fight for his own rights. Others might try to prevent him from living in freedom or having access to his birthrights. But Ishmael will stand boldly in the knowledge of who he is, despite any opposing forces. God sees the injustice of the circumstances of Ishmael's birth. And in these few words, he powerfully breaks every oppression that is due to confront this unborn child. And then he also speaks into the fears of this mother, which is so tender to me that he sees her in this way. He's also speaking to the realities of what she is facing and what her child will face. And yet he pours fresh hope and identity and freedom into them both. Let's come back to the scripture. So verse 13, Hagar, she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are El Roi, God who sees. For she said, have I not even here in the wilderness remained alive after seeing him, who sees me with understanding and compassion? Therefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi, well of the living one who sees me. And it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son to whom Hagar gave birth Ishmael. God hears. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar gave birth to Ishmael. So in response to this wilderness interaction, Hagar makes history. She is the first person in the Bible to name God, not just invoking praises to God, but naming him, giving him a new name, adding to his resume, as it were. She does this in response to him revealing himself to her. El Roi, the God who sees. And even though we don't see anyone else in the Bible, it's not recorded of anyone else calling him these exact words or this exact name, we see this characteristic throughout the Bible. We see how God sees the humanity in people, and he steps down and he leans in and he encounters them. We see that with the woman at the well. We see that when Mary washes Jesus' feet and he personalizes her. We see that with Zacchaeus in the tree and he calls him down. We see it time and time again. He is El Roi, the God who sees. So this woman of low status, with no autonomy or rights, a foreigner and a slave, is encountered by the God who sees. Her humanity is acknowledged. Her story is given room to take up space, and her agency is restored to her in this moment. She is given permission to speak, and she steps into her identity as one made in the likeness of God. Just as Creator God Elohim gave Adam permission to name all of the animals and plants at the beginning of creation, he gives Hagar permission to name himself, to add this name to the book of life that we would then read centuries later. We see the characteristic of God continue to be displayed in this way. What a beautiful act of justice. You know, we talk about here at Expression, we talk about justice being the restoration of every violation of love. And as I read this, this was stunning to me. This is such an act of God's justice, that in this moment of communing with Hagar, he restores every violation of love to her. He restores her humanity. He gives her voice. He gives her agency. He gives her the power to name her unborn child. He restores dignity. He covers her. He pours hope into her. He gives her vision for the future. In this story, we bear witness to many injustices that are done to one another. I'm sure even in telling this story, we can think about present circumstances where massive injustices are taking place. And then on a personal level, things that we may have experienced that feel connected to this story. At times within the story of Abraham and Hagar, these things were done in the name of God and what was believed to be the pursuit of his will. But we also bear witness to the intervention of God, his stepping into time and space in order to encounter the one whom everyone else has looked upon as less than or discardable. He sees her, he calls her by name, and he makes himself known to her. And in the same way, God sees you. He calls you by name, and he wants to make himself known to you. So the story also doesn't end here. We've reached the end of Genesis 16, but we find Hagar again in Genesis chapter 21. Some time passes between these two chapters. More things happen. But I want to read through Genesis 21, verses 9 through 21, and then we'll kind of unpack it a little bit. So now, as time went on, Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking Isaac. So in this time, Sarah and Abraham have had their own biological baby, whose name is Isaac. Therefore, she said to Abraham, "Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac." The situation distressed Abraham greatly because of his son Ishmael. God said to Abraham, "Do not let it distress you because of Ishmael and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her and do what she asks, for your descendants will be named through Isaac. And I will also make a nation of Ishmael, the son of the maid, because he is your descendant." So Abraham got up early in the morning, and he took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, putting them on her shoulder, and gave her the boy and sent her away. And she left, but lost her way and wandered aimlessly in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was all gone, Hagar abandoned the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him, about a bow shot away, for she said, "Do not let me see the boy die." And as she sat down opposite him, she raised her voice and wept. God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy from where he is resting. Get up, help the boy up and hold him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the empty skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with Ishmael, and he grew and developed, and he lived in the wilderness and became an expert archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Okay, so a lot more happens in this story. Isaac is now in the picture, and Isaac and Ishmael are growing up in the house with Abram and Sarai, who have also been renamed. Did you catch that? They're now Sarah and Abraham, which is very significant. In between Genesis 16 and 21, God renames them. And this is tied into, again, the promises that he's spoken over their life. And to me, this also pinpoints identity. Identity is so tied up with names in the Bible. And I want to highlight this for us for a moment too, because God calls us by name. He knows your name, and he knows the meaning of your name, and he also speaks new names over you. So if this is not something that you've encountered God in recently, I want to encourage you to do that. Ask him, God, who do you call me? Who do you say that I am? And see how he responds, because there's fresh identity that he wants to pour into us. Sometimes we carry stuff from our past because of an old name, things that have been spoken over to us, and God wants to set us free from that. So we see in this passage in Genesis 21, where I believe Abram and Sarai are kind of operating out of their old identities a little bit. Fear is entering the picture again. There's threat, there's jealousy. Sarai is looking at these two boys growing up, and she's seeing Ishmael, and he's getting older. It's believed that he could be about 17 in this passage, although some people think he's a bit younger. But imagine a 17-year-old boy, he's getting close to coming of age, and with that, as a woman, there's a threat because she's looking at her biological son. And you see the seed of rejection that has also come in here. She's not fully accepted Ishmael as her own, even though she set up this whole thing to gain children through Hagar. She's not actually fully adopted Ishmael as her own, and so he's become a threat to her. She sees Ishmael as the one who should have all of the rights of the firstborn. And in this context, the firstborn was the one who would receive a double blessing. They'd receive a double inheritance when the father passed away. And as a woman, Sarai is also looking to who is going to be protecting me? Who's going to be providing for me? As a woman, she doesn't have autonomy by herself. She gets no inheritance if Abraham passes. It's all down to her sons and what they choose to do and how they choose to care for her. So there's a lot at stake here. There's a lot at stake that is informing the decisions that are being made, that I believe informs this moment of pushing Hagar and Ishmael out of the home. And so they are forced out, they're made homeless, and they now find themselves in the wilderness again. And yet, we also find God in the wilderness too. You know, and this time he doesn't meet them in person, but what I imagine is him pulling back the heavens and peering in and finding them there. That he speaks to them through the audible voice of God. And he says, "What troubles you? Why are you crying?" He sees them. He humanizes the moment once again. He sees that death is close, and he steps in, he intervenes. He hears the weeping of a mother who's run out of options and no longer knows how to provide for and protect her son. And he hears the cries of a child who is laid down to die in the wilderness, void of hope. God hears and he sees. I believe that he's speaking to us through this passage. I believe that he's saying, "What troubles you?" He's leaning in with questions. He wants to know what's on your heart. What's wrong? Why are you so upset? What is breaking your heart? What ails you? Why has your hope departed? And I believe he responds, "Do not be afraid. Give me your fear. Surrender your circumstances. Let me carry what is weighing you down. Don't let fear be the author of this moment. let me write it for you. I have heard you. I have heard your cries. Your prayers have met my ears, and I have not turned away. I know the pain that you are in. I know the lack that you are experiencing. I see the wilderness all around you. I see the life that is ebbing away from you, but I speak into that and I say, now arise. Take hold of your son. Take hold of that which I have given you. Pick up again the promises that I gave you long ago, for they have not, nor will they ever reach an expiry date. Lay hold of the prophetic words that I have spoken over you. Arise, for I'm going to fulfill my word to you. I am not a man that I would lie. I'm going to make him into a great nation. I'm going to do for you what I said I would do. You will be free, and you will prosper in this land. LA's hard, but you will prosper. You will not stay a victim of your trauma. You will be healed, you will be restored, and you will be provided for. For I will open your eyes. The God who sees brings sight to the ones made in his image. That's you and me and everyone in this room. He brings revelation, and with his revelation comes his provision, and his provision brings restoration to our bodies. Where our bodies have been holding up trauma, where they've been holding up so much, he brings replenishment and restoration till all of our trials have drained out from our feet. He renews our strength so that we are able to continue moving forward, so that we are able to exit the wilderness. And he brings us into a new place of abiding and thriving. He turns the valley of Achor, that wilderness of trouble, into a door of hope and a place of prosperity. Not just for our individual well-being so that we'll be good. No, but for the ultimate thriving of our entire families. There is so much that we can learn from the story of Hagar. From this small window that we get into the lives of a young woman and her son who came from messy circumstances, who had the odds stacked up against them, who weren't born into privilege or status, who didn't have autonomy, they didn't have agency or the advocacy of just systems around them. And from this place, we get the most profound encounter with El Roy, the God who sees me. Maybe this name of God is one that you are intimately familiar with already. Maybe you already have your own wilderness encounter in your back pocket where he met you in your faith journey. Maybe you have met God in this place before, but you find yourself in a space of feeling unseen again. Maybe you've never met El Roy, the God who sees you. But as we've been hearing about Hagar's encounter with him, you're hungering to meet with him. You want to know what he has to say to you. Because when we read of somebody else's story in history, when we read of a story in the Bible, we're reading an invitation to meet with that same God right here and now. El Roy, the God who sees you, is leaning in this morning. I imagine him pulling back those same heavens that he pulled back over Hagar and Ishmael over this room right now. And he's leaning in with the same question that he did centuries ago. What troubles you? What ails you? What's breaking your heart? I'm the God who sees you. I've heard your cries. I'm leaning in. I want to meet with you. I will restore you. I will heal you. I will give you everything that I have promised to give you. We're going to go into a song in a moment. The worship team is going to sing over us, and I want to take this moment to invite you to go a little deeper. And you can choose however you want to respond in this moment. It may be that you just want to sit and listen and take in the lyrics of this song. They are filled with the truth of who God is and how he sees you. It may be that you want to come and stand with somebody. We'll have some people down at the front that can pray with you if you would like that. It may be that you want to write a letter to God in your notebook, that you want to talk to him about what we've been talking about this morning. It may be that you want to stand and sing along. However it is, I want you to invite you to engage in this moment because it's an invitation. The God who sees you is here. He is present, and he is faithful to his word. He is faithful to his children. He is faithful to respond.
Acts 17, 26 through 28. He, the God who sees, has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. Father, thank you for seeing us. Thank you for making us for this time, because you knew it would be the right time for us to find you. So in Jesus' name, I pray that you would release over us a fresh hope and seal in us resurrection, the hope of the resurrection, God, that the fullness of your love is that we never die in you. So God, I pray where there's been loss, where there are wilderness seasons right now in this room, God, I pray for that fresh hope of resurrection power in the name of Jesus, and that you would seal in our hearts the reality of eternity, God, that we would be still and know that you who are outside of time and space have made us for eternity. In Jesus' name.